To a positively decisive extent, the success of the national forces in subjugating the southern states turned on the sea power. The conquest of the Confederacy was, in fact, a matter of supreme difficulty as it was, and if the South had possessed a respectable navy and had been able to keep its ports open and steadily exchange its cotton in Europe for the materials and munitions of war, the conquest would not have been possible at all. The chance for the establishment of such a navy lay within the grasp of the Confederate statesmen and was by them let slip. Neither they nor anyone else at the time realized how easy the thing would have been. It is first necessary to explain in what situation the national government was at the outset of the war in the matter of a naval force. Nominally, the United States Navy consisted of 90 vessels, but of these 50 were utterly obsolete and unusable, except as supply ships. Of the other 40, 20 were in a state of hopeless unreadiness. Several of the best ships were in the remotest corners of the world. The home squadron was composed of 12 ships, of which only 7 were steamers. Nearly 50 years after the invention of steam navigation, the United States depended principally upon sailing vessels for its defense. Only 3 trustworthy warships were left in northern waters for the defense of such ports as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. As between the North and the South, the chance to wield the sea power lay with the one of the 2 rival governments which should first put on the water even a very small fleet of ironclad, steam-driven vessels. The Confederacy proved afterward what power could be exerted in this direction with but one single ironclad, when the Merrimac destroyed or scattered all the ships in Hampton Roads, for a moment threatened Washington and the northern cities with ravage, and was checked at last only by the almost providential appearance of another ironclad, Ericsson's Little Monitor, on the scene. And the Alabama's armor of chains made her for a time almost a match for the United States Navy. By what means could the Confederacy have forestalled the North in the provision of a really effective navy? The chance was offered and declined, with fatal want of foresight. It lay in the 10 steamships of the English East India Company, which in 1861 was winding up its affairs. These ships were offered to the Confederacy at a fair valuation. They were very good vessels and capable of prompt armoring in at least as effective a style as that in which the Alabama was afterwards armored. The East India Company was prepared to make such terms as the Confederate government could have met. British outfitters were perfectly willing to trust the Southern statesmen. The ships could have been armed in a few weeks. There was nothing to prevent their entrance into southern ports, for the blockade was not made effective until 1 year after the war broke out. The Otero, renamed by the Confederates the Florida, had no difficulty in taking on her men and guns in the Bahamas. Possessed of 10 good steam vessels, commanded by such men as Maury, Maffitt of the Florida, and Semmes of the Alabama, the Confederacy could have quickly overcome its lack of mechanics and workshops by importation from Europe. It was the command of the Mississippi, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee rivers which broke the back of the Confederacy. And does anyone imagine that the wooden ships of Farragut could have entered the Mississippi, compelled the abandonment of New Orleans, and secured the possession of not only the seacoast, but the inland river waters, which commanded the Confederacy from the rear, if there had been any good ships to resist him? The start which these 10 ships would have given a Confederate navy would have more than put the South even with the North on the sea. It must be remembered that up to 1862, the South could do better in the courts and exchanges of Europe than the Union could. Why? Because the South had the cotton upon which the mills of Europe depended. The continued chance to market cotton would have saved the situation for the South. Alabamas in any requisite number would have issued from British shipyards, and as it was, several powerful rams were under construction for the Confederacy in 1861 and 1862 in the yards of the Lairds. But the continued insistence of Minister Adams on the unlawfulness of this proceeding, joined with the fact that the Confederates had no recognizable navy to back up their purchases, at last compelled the British government to take these rams over and add them to its own sea power. President Jefferson Davis declined the offer of the East India ships for the apparent reason that the military necessities of the Confederacy pressed hard upon the financial resources of the new government. Every member of his government was quite thoroughly convinced that the national power could not successfully invade the South, provided a strong army, were quickly put into the field. The ready material for good soldiers was much more abundant in the south than in the north. Nearly all southern men were horsemen, hunters, marksmen, outdoors men. On the other hand, the first levies from the north were mostly city men, unaccustomed to firearms, strangers to exposure, flabby of physique. Manassas amply illustrated the great superiority as soldiers of the first comers from the south over the first comers from the north. The Confederate leaders counted upon making permanent the advantage which they were confident of gaining in the field at the outset. To purchase out of hand 10 steamships from resources that were yet to be created, and with the men of 7 states demanding to be armed, looked indeed like madness. And yet this was the very card which, if played, would have saved the Confederacy's game. Conceive for a moment the Union Navy debarred from entrance into the James or any of the navigable waters of Virginia to support military operations in the direction of Richmond. Conceive Wilmington, North Carolina, which was an easily defensible port and which really remained open to the blockade runners for almost 2 years after the beginning of the war, rendered a fairly safe point of departure for European trade throughout the war. Conceive the Mississippi, from Cairo southward to its mouth, continuously under the power of the Confederacy, with a fleet of river gunboats backed up by a Gulf squadron. Does anyone imagine that in that case, the North could have made either any warlike or commercial use of the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee, or even the Mississippi from Cairo up to St. Louis? Freed from the unceasing coast menace and from the danger of being cut in two along the rivers, the effectiveness of the land forces would have been more than doubled. Leaving out of the account the possibility of offensive operations against Washington and the cities of the North, the defense of the seceded states could have been made so secure that the people of the North would have called loudly for peace. The border slave states would have cast in their lot with the Confederacy, and England and France would have openly sided with the South. Secession would have triumphed definitely before the end of the year 1863. With the English East India Company, it was a case of take our ships or leave them. The South left them, and with them it left its chance for independence and for putting 2 mediocre American republics in the place where one great one was bound to stand forever.